The Duke said he could replace her with 50 women. She just picked up her bag and walked. The number in the margin was wrong. Isobel Kerr knew figures the way other women knew scripture, and this one was wrong on purpose. She sat very still at the long refectory table in the Ashcombe library, the green-spined ledger open under her hands, and felt the small, cold click of a lock turning somewhere in her chest. £14 recorded in the official column, £20 noted in a fainter hand beside it, with the initials EW and a single word she would read 100 times before the week was out: surplus. She did not yet know that within 7 days she would stand in a Duke's study and watch his face turn to stone, that she would walk out of Ashcombe Hall before dawn with everything she owned in one bag, or that a man in his dinner clothes would come running down a country road after her as if his life depended on catching a coach he had no business chasing. She only knew, in that first moment, that the house had been lying to her for 2 months, and that she had just caught it. If you're new here, welcome. Stay a while, because this one gets worse before it gets better, and then it gets better than you'd expect. She had come to Ashcombe 10 weeks earlier with a single trunk and a letter of reference from a vicarage in Sussex, hired by the current Duke to do exactly one thing: bring order to this chaos, he had told her, in the only real conversation they'd ever had, standing in a doorway as though the room itself offended him. I want to know what is in this library. That is all. He had not asked her opinion of the house, or of him, or of anything else. He had issued the instruction and left, and Isobel, who had spent her whole adult life as the quiet, useful daughter of a poor clergyman, skilled at making herself small in other people's rooms, had accepted the terms without complaint. Invisibility suited her. It always had. The library itself told her everything the Duke wouldn't. Ashcombe was a house in the last stages of a slow collapse, dressed up as grandeur. Stone walls that still looked solid from the drive, tapestries gone soft with damp in the long gallery, entire wings shuttered and sheeted like a house in mourning for itself. The staff spoke of it the way people speak of a sickness in the family nobody wants to name aloud. The old Duke had let it happen. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ainsley, said once, tight-lipped, and the current Duke was killing himself trying to undo it. Isobel had seen him perhaps a dozen times in 10 weeks. A tall, contained man, with eyes the gray of a sky before snow, always mid-stride towards some fresh emergency, London or the tenant farms or his solicitor. He looked at her the way he looked at the furniture. She hadn't minded. She told herself she hadn't minded, and most days that was even close to true. There had been one small moment, weeks before, that she hadn't thought much of at the time, and would think about constantly afterward. She'd been carrying an armful of estate atlases up the library steps when he'd passed through unexpectedly, on his way to somewhere else as always, and for half a second, no more, he'd stopped and taken half the stack out of her arms without a word, set it on the table, and walked out again before she could even thank him. It wasn't kindness exactly. It barely registered as an interaction at all. But she had noticed it, filed it away the way she filed everything, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing, because a Duke who looked through you the rest of the time didn't suddenly see you over a stack of books. Then she found the ledgers. Not one entry, not an accident. She pulled volume after volume from the oak chest at the back of the room, and the pattern held across 20 years. An official rent recorded in a steward's careful hand, and beside it, fainter, a second number, always higher, always marked revised per EW, and routed, according to a private almanac she found 3 days later, to something called the London account. Tenant families whose names she recognized from the estate rent rolls. Families still living on this land. still touching their caps to her on the drive. The old Duke, beloved by every account, mourned publicly, painted in the great hall with a smile so warm it looked like sunlight, had spent 2 decades quietly robbing the people who trusted him, a few shillings at a time, multiplied across dozens of farms, year after year, until it added up to a fortune that had simply vanished into nothing. Here's the part I need you to sit with for a second, because it's the whole engine of this story. It wasn't bad luck that broke this estate. It was theft. And Isobel Kerr, who had been hired to sort books and nothing else, was the only person alive who knew it. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself this for 4 days, cataloging philosophy and poetry with hands that no longer quite believed in the task, walking past tenant farmers who tipped their caps to her on the drive, men whose fathers, she now knew, had been quietly bled by the man smiling down from the portrait in the hall. She thought of her own father, who had never had 2 shillings to rub together in his life, and had never once taken what wasn't his, and felt something in her chest go tight with a fury she hadn't expected. Integrity, he used to say, isn't a thing you have, it's a thing you do. She had grown up half believing it was simply a nice thing vicars said to keep their daughters obedient. She was about to find out it was true, and that it was going to cost her nearly everything she had left. She spent a week compiling the proof. Clean transcriptions, ledger numbers, page references, cross-checked against the almanac until the case was airtight and cold and undeniable. Some nights she worked by a single oil lamp until her eyes ached and the library sank into deep shadow around her, and she had the strange, persistent sense that the house itself was watching her finish what it had spent 20 years hiding. When she was finished, she had a slim dossier that could unmake a dead man's reputation and the living one's peace of mind in a single evening. She held it in her hands the night before she requested the interview and felt genuinely afraid, not of losing her post, though she understood she almost certainly would, but of what it meant to hand a man proof that his father had been a thief. She asked Mrs. Ainsley for an audience with the Duke anyway. The housekeeper's eyes sharpened with something like foreboding. "His Grace leaves for London in 2 days," she said. "It's a matter concerning the archives," Isobel told her, which was true, and also nowhere near the whole truth. The summons came the next evening. "I want you to remember that study, because we're about to spend a long night in it." Sebastian Whitmore's study smelled of leather, old paper, and the faint bite of whiskey, lit by a fire too low to properly warm a room that size. He was standing at the window in his dinner clothes when she entered, and he didn't turn. "My business was urgent," he said to the glass, in the flat, impatient tone of a man rationing his attention. "It is, Your Grace." She crossed the carpet and stopped at a respectful distance, the papers held perfectly still in her hands, though her pulse was not still at all. When he finally turned, his eyes swept over her, the way they always did, cool, already elsewhere. "I have little time for trivialities, Miss Kerr. I am trying to secure a loan to keep this estate solvent through the winter." The irony of that sentence nearly stopped her breath. He was about to go into debt to fix a hole his own father had dug with stolen money, and he had no idea. "What I have to say concerns the estate's finances," she said. "It concerns the archives." An eyebrow lifted, the first flicker of interest she'd ever seen cross his face. "Have you found a lost Rembrandt, Miss Kerr? A first folio?" "I have found a system of fraud," she said, keeping her voice level though her hands were not, "perpetrated by the late Duke against the tenants of this estate for more than 20 years. The silence that followed had weight. A log shifted in the grate, sending up a small shower of sparks, and the Duke's face, which had been merely cold, became something closer to marble. "Repeat what you just said," he said. very quietly. And quiet, she was learning in real time, was far more dangerous on him than shouting. She repeated it. She laid the papers on his desk. He didn't look at them. "You are a librarian," he said, "hired to sort books. You are not an accountant. You are not a magistrate." "I am an archivist," she corrected him, gently, "and my duty is to the truth of the record." "The truth?" he laughed, one short, humorless sound. "You have been here 10 weeks. You look at a few old books, and you presume to understand this family. You presume to slander a man who was loved and admired by everyone who knew him. The evidence is on those pages, Your Grace." "I will not look at them," he snapped, and something in his control gave way at last. He crossed the room toward her, close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw. "This is a fantasy, the work of a bored, over-imaginative woman who has overstepped her station considerably." It stung exactly as much as he meant it to. She held his eyes anyway. "It is not fantasy, Your Grace. It is the truth, and it's sitting on your desk." "No," he said, turning away to the fire, bracing both hands on the mantel, his back a wall. "You are dismissed, Miss Kerr. I want you gone by morning." And here's where most women in her position would have wept, or begged, or apologized for a truth that didn't deserve an apology. Isobel did none of it. A strange calm settled over her instead, cold and clean as well water. "Do you know what I think?" he said, still not looking at her, his voice low and shaking with fury now. "I think you saw a failing estate and a desperate man and decided this information might be worth something to you." That accusation cracked something open in her that his dismissal hadn't touched. "I want nothing from you, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and hard as glass. "Only for you to see what's already in front of you." He turned then, and his face had gone past anger into something closer to contempt. "I see a disloyal employee. I was a fool to hire. I can hire 50 like you. 50 like you." Sit with that phrase for a second, because it's the ugliest line in this whole story, and it's about to be the reason he loses everything he thinks he still has. "Then do it," Isobel said. Not loud, just final. She turned and walked to the door, and she did not look back, though she heard the sharp intake of his breath behind her, the sound of a man who had expected tears and gotten a locked door instead. She closed it quietly. The click of the latch, she would learn much later, was the loudest sound he'd heard in 5 years. Stay with me here, because the story doesn't follow her out that door. It stays behind with him, and what happens in that study over the next 6 hours is the real turn of this whole night. Sebastian stood frozen in the sudden ringing quiet, staring at the door, his fury banking from a hot, roaring thing into something colder and far heavier. His first instinct was to sweep her papers straight into the fire. His hand actually hovered over them, ready to erase her accusation from his house entirely. He was the Duke of Ashcombe. His father had been the Duke of Ashcombe before him, and their name was the one solid thing this crumbling estate still had. And this woman, this penniless vicar's daughter he'd hired to sort books, had just tried to knock it down. He sat instead. He doesn't fully understand why, even afterward. Call it pride, maybe. The certainty that if he read her fantasy closely enough, he'd find the crack in it, the misreading that would let him burn it with a clean conscience. His father's portrait loomed over the mantel as he opened the dossier, the painted mouth curved in that famous, generous smile. Sebastian had grown up in the warmth of that smile, and the shadow of it in equal measure. 5 years since his father's sudden death had left him the title, the estate, and debts he'd assumed were the ordinary carelessness of a gentleman who'd never had to worry about money. He had never once suspected malice. Her handwriting was as precise as her speech. Tenant, farm, ledger number, page number, official rent, cross-referenced almanac entry, margin note. He read the name Pharaoh and recognized it. A family still working that land, their sons still tipping their caps to him on the drive. He read Comden and Mead and half a dozen more, and the pattern held every single time. Too consistent to be coincidence, too methodical to be error. He got up. He pulled the actual ledger from the shelf, something he had never once done, because the archives were the steward's business, not his. He found the page. There it was, the steward's careful entry, and beside it, in his father's familiar, arrogant hand, revised per EW. He found the almanac. He found the surplus. It was all true, every word of it. The anger drained out of him so fast it left him hollow. He spent the rest of that night the way you spend a night. Finding out the floor of your own life was never solid. Pulling down ledger after ledger, journal after journal. The fire dying to embers around him, while dawn crept gray through the windows, and he didn't notice. His father's portrait stopped looking kind, somewhere around 4 in the morning. The smile started to look like a smirk. The man in the frame was a stranger who had spent 20 years treating the people who trusted him as a resource to be quietly, endlessly drained, and the money hadn't even survived him. It had gone into failed speculations, gone the way stolen money so often goes, into nothing, leaving only the wound behind. And underneath the shame, underneath the horror of watching his father unmake himself page by page, one thought kept surfacing, sharper each time. I can hire 50 like you. He had said that to the only person who had ever told him the truth in 5 years, and he had said it like an insult. He looked at the clock, nearly 6. The public coach through the village left at 7. She would be on it. He didn't change his clothes. He didn't call for a servant. He walked out of that study in his crumpled dinner black, past the portrait of a man he no longer recognized, out the front door and into cold, wet morning air, and started to run. I promised you a man running down a road in his evening clothes. Here he comes. Isobel had packed before dawn. It hadn't taken long. There wasn't much to pack. A few dresses, her father's copy of Virgil, a small portfolio of botanical drawings she made when no one was watching. She left her room exactly as she'd found it. In the hall, Mrs. Ainsley was waiting with a small cloth-wrapped parcel. Bread, cheese, something for the road, and a look in her eyes that was as close to open feeling as the housekeeper ever allowed herself. Some people, Mrs. Ainsley said quietly, aren't ready for the truth, especially when it's about their own blood. Isobel squeezed her hand and couldn't answer, because her throat had closed, and walked out into a mist the color of pearl. The village was a mile off. She walked it with her chin up, and something clean and sharp in her chest that wasn't quite regret. She had done the right thing. What happened next wasn't hers to control. She reached the crossroads just as the coach rattled into view, took her place among the handful of waiting passengers, breath pluming white in the cold, and set her bag down at her feet. That's when she heard the footsteps. She saw him before she understood what she was seeing, a figure running full out down the road from the direction of the manor, hair uncombed, evening coat creased and filthy at the hem, breathing like a man who'd run the whole distance without stopping once. The other passengers stared, open-mouthed, at the sight of a duke sprinting down a public road at dawn in last night's dinner clothes. He didn't seem to notice them at all. His eyes were on her, and they weren't cold anymore. They were the eyes of a man standing in the wreckage of everything he thought he knew, looking at the only person who'd told him the truth. "You were right," he said. Just that. 2 words, and his voice cracked slightly on the second one. The coach driver called for passengers. The others began to board. Isobel stood exactly where she was, heart slamming, and did not move toward the coach. "Don't go," he said. It wasn't an order. She'd never heard him say anything that wasn't an order, and this wasn't one. "Stay. Help me make it right. If you think you know what she said next, stay with me." Because what she actually chose to do with that moment is the reason this whole story exists. The driver shouted again, impatient, "Are you getting on or not, miss?" And Isobel looked at the coach, at the open door that represented the whole quiet, small, safe life she'd been planning to disappear back into, and then she looked at the man standing in the road in his ruined evening clothes, carrying the full weight of what he'd learned in one long, sleepless night. Leaving now wouldn't just mean abandoning him. It would mean abandoning the tenants she'd spent a week fighting for on paper, walking away from the only chance any of them had at seeing this made right. Her work, she realized, wasn't finished. It had barely started. "No," she told the driver, and picked her bag back up off the ground herself before he could reach for it. "I am not." They walked back to the manor together in silence, the sun starting to break the mist into long gold shafts across the fields, and it felt, she would tell him much later, and mean it, like the first morning of an entirely different life. Here's where the story could have ended, neat and simple. It doesn't. Making a wrong right, it turns out, is a great deal harder than admitting it exists. And that's what took up the whole next year. The library became the headquarters of their restoration, the same table where she'd first found the ledger, now buried under estate maps and columns of figures. Sebastian canceled the trip to London outright. A loan would just be another lie, he told her, staring at the numbers. Borrowing money to repay money that was already stolen, a phantom chasing its own tail. What they had to work with was very little. Making it right meant selling nearly everything that wasn't entailed to the title. The London townhouse, a collection of paintings, his mother's jewels, his father's sculptures. He didn't flinch once, though she watched it cost him something every single time he signed a letter away. "Let them talk," he said one evening, sealing the sale of a stock portfolio with a hand that had gone very steady. It's better than living the lie any longer. Then came the part neither of them could do from behind a desk. They went farm to farm, together, because he'd asked her to come as a witness. "So they know it isn't just another one of a duke's promises," he said, and she understood exactly what he meant. The first farm belonged to old Pharaoh, whose father had been the very first name in the very first ledger she'd read. And Isobel watched Sebastian stand in a cold farmyard, hat in hand, and say the truth out loud with no excuse folded into it. "My father stole from your family for 20 years, he told the old man, his voice stripped of every trace of its usual polish. "I'm here to tell you the truth and start making it right." Pharaoh said nothing for a long moment, just looked at the Duke with eyes that had clearly rehearsed 100 versions of this scene in his own head over the years, and gotten none of them right. Then he asked, quietly, "Why now?" "Because a woman I nearly threw out of my house wouldn't let me look away," Sebastian said, and didn't look at Isobel when he said it, though she felt the words land in her chest all the same. Not every farm went so gently. At the Comden holding, a woman not much older than Isobel herself listened to the whole confession with her arms folded and her jaw set, and when Sebastian finished, she said only, "My mother died owed money by your father, and she died believing it was her own fault for a bad harvest. What do you have that fixes that?" He had no answer for it. He didn't try to invent one. "I don't," he admitted. I can only tell you the truth now instead of letting the lie stand any longer. She didn't take his hand when he offered it, but she did, eventually, take the corrected lease, and Isobel understood that some doors only ever open a crack, and that a crack was still worth everything. Isobel kept a private accounting of her own that she never showed him, not figures but faces, which families had wept, which had gone silent, which had simply nodded once and shown them the door without unkindness. She found she could predict, with unsettling accuracy, which reaction a family would have before Sebastian even finished speaking, simply from the way they'd greeted the carriage coming up the lane. It unsettled her, how well she'd come to read the wreckage of other people's trust. It unsettled her more, on the ride home one evening, to realize she had started reading him with the same close attention, the particular way his hands tightened on the reins before a hard conversation, the exact half-second delay before he made himself walk up to a cottage door. She hadn't decided to learn him. It had simply happened the way weather happens, while she was busy watching everyone else. At the Mead farm, an old man whose own father had lost the land entirely 2 generations back simply turned his back on Sebastian mid-sentence and walked into his cottage and shut the door. Sebastian stood in the yard a long moment afterward, and Isobel didn't try to comfort him with anything false. "Some of them will never forgive it," she said quietly, walking beside him back toward the lane. "And you don't get to ask them to." He nodded, jaw tight, and said nothing the whole walk back. And she let the silence sit there because some silences deserve to. There was one visit that stayed with her longer than the rest, though it happened almost quietly compared to the others. Rain caught them halfway to the last farm on the schedule, coming down in a hard gray sheet that turned the lane to mud within minutes, and they took shelter under the low stone bridge at the edge of the Mead boundary, standing close enough that she could hear him breathing over the rain. Neither of them said anything useful. He looked, for once, less like a duke reciting a confession, and more like a tired man waiting out weather, and when she glanced sideways at him he was already looking at her, an expression on his face she hadn't yet learned to name. "I used to think this land was mine by right," he said finally, watching the water sheet off the bridge stones. "I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I think it's only mine as long as I take care of it properly. That's rather the whole of it, isn't it?" she said, and he almost laughed, and for a moment the rain and the ruined farms and the 20 years of theft between them felt very far away. Slowly, painstakingly, farm by farm, new leases were drawn. Debts were forgiven. What money there was got repaid, with a promise of more as each remaining asset sold. It didn't fix everything. Nothing was going to fix everything. But it was real, and it was the beginning of something that hadn't existed at Ashcombe in a generation. A duke who didn't hide behind the title when the truth was inconvenient. And somewhere in the middle of all that hard, unglamorous work, the shared meals in the small morning room instead of the cavernous dining hall, the late nights over ledgers with cold tea going colder, the long, silent rides between farms where neither of them felt any need to fill the quiet. Something shifted between them that neither one had planned for, and neither one, by the time they noticed it, particularly wanted to stop. She started to see the man under the cold duke she'd first met. The dry, exhausted wit that surfaced when he'd been awake too long. The way he'd once looked up from a column of figures at 2 in the morning and said, entirely deadpan, "Remind me again why honesty was supposed to be the easy part." She caught herself laughing before she'd decided to. She noticed, too, the way his voice actually warmed when he talked about the land itself, apart from all its debts, the particular slope of a field he wanted to drain properly, the orchard he meant to replant even though he might not live to see it bear fruit. He wasn't just a title anymore. He was a man who had found out his whole inheritance was built on a lie, and chosen, deliberately, day after unglamorous day, to rebuild it honestly instead of simply protecting the lie. He, in turn, finally saw her. Not the invisible furniture he'd first walked past in the hall, but a woman of fierce intelligence and total, unshowy steadiness, the only person who had ever stood in front of him and refused to flinch. He found himself arranging reasons to be in the library in the evenings that had nothing to do with the ledgers at all, and pretending, badly, that they did. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She simply left the lamp burning a little longer than the work strictly required. There was an evening, not long before the last of the papers were signed, when he asked her, almost carelessly, the way men ask questions they've been rehearsing for weeks, why she had come back that morning at the crossroads at all, when she'd had every reason not to. She thought about it honestly before she answered, turning her pen over in her fingers. Because leaving would have meant the truth only mattered until it was inconvenient, she said finally. And I couldn't live with having proved that. He was quiet for a long moment. That's not the whole of it, though, is it? He said, watching her with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in her life, entirely and uncomfortably seen. She didn't answer that one. She didn't have to. He didn't press her, but something had been said all the same, in the not answering, and they both knew it. One evening, months later, with the last of the restitution papers signed and sealed, and the London house sold and gone, Sebastian leaned back in his chair and said, "It's done." "It's begun," Isobel corrected him, softly, and he looked at her across the table in the lamplight and felt something close to panic at the thought that her work here really was finished now, that she was, technically, free to leave. "What will you do now?" he asked, careful, and she told him honestly that she hadn't thought that far. Another position, probably. Another library that needed sorting. "I can hire 50 like you," rose up in his memory and turned his stomach the way it always did now. He could hire 50 librarians. There was only one Isobel Kerr. "I have another position in mind," he said, his heart going hard against his ribs, "if you'd consider it." "This house needs more than a duke," he told her. "It needs a conscience." He stood, crossed to where she sat, didn't touch her, just stood there with his vulnerability laid completely bare for the first time since she'd known him. "I need you, Isobel, not as an archivist, as my wife, as my partner in all of it." She didn't answer with words. She reached out and laid her hand over his on the table, and he covered it with his other hand, and something in the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, almost, told her everything the words hadn't. 1 year later, the Ashcombe Library wasn't a tomb of buried secrets anymore. The windows were clean. Afternoon light fell across shelves that were, finally, in perfect order, and the long refectory table that had once held ledgers of theft now held plans for new orchards and mended stone walls. Isobel, now the Duchess, stood at the window watching gardeners work in rose beds that had been wilderness the year before, the first snowdrops just breaking through the cold ground. The estate wasn't wealthy. It might not be, for a generation, but it was solvent, it was honest. Sebastian came in from the tenant farms, mud on his boots, the haunted look he'd worn the night she met him finally gone from his face. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin on her shoulder, and told her that Pharaoh's son was getting married, and had asked whether they might hold the wedding on the south lawn. "A year ago," Isobel said, smiling, "no tenant would have dared ask." "And what did you tell him?" "That we'd be honored to attend." He asked her once, quietly, watching the hills, whether she ever regretted it. This life, no London season, no grand balls, not the life a duchess was supposed to have. She turned in his arms, hand flat against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady under her palm, and thought of the quiet, invisible life she might have lived instead, always on the edge of someone else's room. "I have never been happier," she told him, and it was the plain, unvarnished truth. There were still hard days. Not every tenant had forgiven them, and some never would. Old Meade still shut his door whenever the Duke's carriage came up his lane, and Isobel had learned not to pretend that wound would ever fully close. There were still evenings when Sebastian sat too long over the account books, doing sums that never quite balanced the way he wanted them to, and she would find him there and simply sit across from him without a word until his shoulders came down from around his ears. Healing, she had come to understand, wasn't a single bright morning at a crossroads. It was this, the slow, unglamorous accumulation of ordinary days that didn't undo what had been done, only built something honest next to it. That night, she found him in the library again, and for 1 second his chest tightened, the old ghost of shame reflexively bracing itself. "Revisiting the past?" he asked softly. She smiled without looking up. "Starting a new one." It wasn't leases or rents on the page in front of her. It was a fresh green ledger, blank pages at the back, and in her clear hand she'd already begun a new record. Ashcombe Estate, 1817. South Lawn offered for the wedding of Thomas Farrow and Mary Cumden. First snowdrops in the East Garden. Downstairs she could hear the muted clatter of the kitchen finishing its work for tomorrow's wedding, and somewhere further off, faintly, a fiddle being tuned. It was such an ordinary sound for a house that had spent so long in silence, and it struck her, not for the first time, that healing mostly just sounded like noise, coming back into a place that had gone quiet with shame. She wasn't recording the estate's money anymore. She was recording its life, the small, ordinary proof that it was healing. He put his hand over hers on the open page, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. The past stayed with them, the way scars do, never gone, never quite forgotten, the cost of the truth permanently written into the walls of that house. But the page in front of them was empty and clean and theirs, and they were going to fill it together, one small, ordinary, honest entry at a time. Sometimes, in the quiet after he'd gone up to bed, Isobel would sit alone with that green ledger a while longer, tracing a finger along the spine that had once cracked open under her hands and changed everything. She thought of the woman who had stood at that crossroads a year ago, certain she was walking away from Ashcombe for good, and felt no pity for her at all, only a kind of fierce, private gratitude that she had chosen, in the end, to turn back toward the harder thing instead of the safer one. She closed the ledger, banked the lamp, and climbed the stairs to a house that no longer held its breath. So tell me, if you'd been in Isobel's place, standing at that crossroads with the coach door open in front of you, would you have gotten on? Tell me which city you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because the next story starts the moment a woman finds something in a locked drawer she was never meant to see.